Before the snow had a name. You ever wonder how a place so cold could burn so hot with history? Russia. Just saying the name feels like a deep breath in winter. You can almost hear the wind over the steppes, the crunch of boots on snow that never melts the weight of stories carried across centuries. I remember reading once in an old book I found at a second-hand store in St. Paul, the kind with cracked spines and that smell of dust and ink. It said, "Russia doesn't move, it waits." And maybe that's true. Because before it was an empire, before Tsars or gulags or revolutions, before even the name Russia meant anything to the rest of the world, there were just people, living by rivers, herding reindeer, worshipping skies and forests. That's where we begin tonight. Not with war, not with glory, but with silence, with a land so vast it took generations just to map its edges, and even longer to understand its soul. Close your eyes. I'll take you back. The Forest and the Fire: Slavic Roots and the Rise of Kievan Rus. I once read in an old university text, thick as a brick and dry as toast, that the Slavs migrated peacefully into the forested zones of Eastern Europe. That's one way to say it. But I've always felt like the story missed something. It wasn't just a migration. It was a slow soaking of people into a land, like snow, melting into spring soil. Quiet, steady, inevitable. Sometime after the fall of the Roman Empire, while Western Europe scrambled to pick up the pieces, Slavic tribes were settling in what we now call Ukraine, Belarus, and Western Russia. No maps, no borders, just rivers and trees and seasons. These early Slavs weren't a single group. They were farmers, fishermen, traders. They worshipped nature gods of thunder and rivers, sun and soil. Life was simple, and survival meant respecting the forest more than fearing any king. But the forest doesn't stay quiet forever. By the 8th century, the Norse had found them. Vikings, yes, but not the kind with horned helmets. These were Swedish traders and warriors called the Varangians. They came down the river's real highways of the time on sleek, shallow boats. They weren't always welcome, but they were persistent. One of their leaders, a man named Rurik, is said to have been invited to rule over the Slavs. That's what the old Russian primary chronicle claims. "Come and rule over us, for our land is great and rich, but there is no order in it." Sounds a bit like asking the wolf to guard the sheep, doesn't it? Still, Rurik took the offer. Around 862 AD, he established himself in Novgorod, way up north. And just like that, the seed of something new was planted, a dynasty, a beginning. After Rurik, his successors, most notably his relative Oleg, moved south and captured the city of Kyiv. That city became the center of what would be called Kievan Rus. You may have heard the name in headlines, recently tossed around with politics and borders. But back then, it was just a rising city-state built on trade, tribute, and ambition. And here's the twist: Kievan Rus wasn't purely Slavic. It was a hybrid, a mix of Norse governance, Slavic culture, and Byzantine influence. The fire that would become Russia was sparked by many hands. Speaking of Byzantium, one of the most pivotal moments in this era came not from a battle, but from a baptism. Prince Vladimir of Kyiv, ruler, in the late 900s, wanted unity. Religion, he believed, could provide that. So according to legend, he auditioned the world's major religions: Judaism, Islam, Western Christianity, and Eastern Orthodoxy. He settled on Orthodox Christianity, drawn, in part, by the grandeur of the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. A delegation he sent returned, saying, "We no longer knew whether we were in heaven or on earth." So Vladimir got baptized, and so did his people. Not overnight, of course. It's hard to wash away centuries of old beliefs with one dunk in the river. But the Christianization of Kievan Rus in 988 AD changed everything: art, language, law, diplomacy. Now I've read modern scholars debate whether Vladimir's choice was spiritual or strategic. Probably both. In politics, the two often dance together. But regardless of motive, that moment tethered Russia's soul to the east, to Byzantium, rather than to the Catholic West. And that tether would hold through centuries of storms. Still, it wasn't all cathedrals and choirs. Kievan Rus was a state of ambition and blood. Princes squabbled, peasants toiled, fortresses rose, enemies watched, and always the rivers flowed. Let me tell you something that stuck with me. I once heard a professor describe early Rus not as a kingdom, but as a network of river-linked cities. Imagine that your empire is only as strong as your current. Trade with the Byzantine Empire brought wealth, furs, wax, slaves, silver, and power followed money. But power also attracts danger. The Pechenegs from the steppes, the Cumans, the pressures of inheritance wars, and fragile succession. By the year 1000, Kievan Rus was at its peak. A constellation of cities, Kyiv, Novgorod, Smolensk, connected by bloodlines and trade routes, speaking Old East Slavic and praying in Church Slavonic. It was a golden time, if only for a moment. And maybe that's the thing with golden ages. They never announce themselves when they arrive. You only realize it was golden when it's already turning to dusk. But before we lose the light, let's linger here for just a second. Picture it: domed churches rising over wooden homes, bells ringing softly through early snow, a scribe scratching letters by candlelight, a trader hauling goods down the Dnieper, a prince whispering prayers in a tongue still thick with old gods. This was not yet Russia, but it was the breath before the name. Thrones and brothers. The fragmentation of Rus and the shadow of the Mongols. I used to think medieval politics were all about knights and kings, battles and banners. But in the case of early Russia, well, it was more like family drama meets geography class. After Vladimir the Great's death in 1015, everything got complicated. He had many sons, some sources say over a dozen. And like any good medieval power struggle, there wasn't a clear winner. No neat inheritance. Just a map full of brothers with swords. The result: civil war. Yaroslav the Wise eventually came out on top, and for a while things looked promising. He built churches, schools, and codified laws. He even married his daughters and sisters into European royal families, from Norway to France. For a moment, Rus was on the diplomatic map. But here's the trouble with royal succession in Kievan Rus. It wasn't based on primogeniture like in Western Europe. Power passed laterally from brother to brother before going to the next generation. Which sounds noble until you realize it created a never-ending relay race of rivalry. So after Yaroslav's death in 1054, the fragmentation began in earnest. Kyiv remained the spiritual and symbolic heart, but the real power started shifting outward to Novgorod in the north, Vladimir Suzdal in the northeast, and eventually to places like Galicia and Smolensk. Each city was ruled by a prince. Each prince was a cousin or nephew or son of someone else, and each one wanted more. I once saw a chart of the Rurikid family tree during this period. It looked less like a tree and more like a pile of tangled fishing line. Wars flared, alliances crumbled. Sometimes brothers made peace only to break it the next winter. Kyiv itself was sacked multiple times, not by outsiders, but by its own princely kin. Meanwhile, the Byzantine Empire, Rus's closest religious and cultural partner, was weakening. That old lifeline of wealth and influence began to fray. And in the east, something ominous was stirring. At the edges of the steppe, the Mongol tribes were beginning to move. No one in Rus saw it coming, not really. They were too busy fighting over who got to sit on which throne, and which nephew betrayed which uncle last spring. But before the Mongol storm, another force briefly tried to pull things together: the Church. As the political structure splintered, the Orthodox Church stepped in as a unifying force. Monasteries flourished. Religious texts were copied and shared. Saints were canonized. Pilgrimages became common. If princes couldn't unite the people, maybe heaven could. One monk, Nestor, wrote the primary chronicle, a sweeping account of Rus's origins, blending history, legend, and piety. It was like a medieval version of national memory. He didn't just record events. He told a story of chosen people, of divine destiny. But stories alone couldn't stop arrows. Let me paint a picture for you. It's the year 1185. In the southeastern steppes, a Rus prince named Igor leads a campaign against the nomadic Cumans. He's brave, ambitious, and unprepared. His forces are scattered. The Cumans counterattack. Igor is captured. His army is crushed. This event inspired the tale of Igor's campaign, one of the oldest surviving works of East Slavic literature. Poetic, lyrical, lamenting. But behind the verse is a truth. Rus was vulnerable, divided, and the steppe was watching. In the north, Novgorod grew strong through trade, especially with the Hanseatic League. They exported furs, wax, and honey. The city was run not by a prince alone, but by a vetch, a kind of public assembly. It was, in some ways, Russia's first experiment with civic participation. In the northeast, the Principality of Vladimir Suzdal was rising. Forested, remote, but ambitious. New churches, new roads, a sense that maybe the center of power was drifting that way. And then, there was Kyiv. Once the crown jewel of Kievan Rus, Kyiv was by now a city under siege, not from outside, but from within. By the late 1100s, its influence was fading. Princes still coveted it, yes, but mostly for prestige. Real power was moving elsewhere. And over the horizon, beyond the Volga, beyond the Urals, across endless grasslands, the Mongols were coming. They weren't just a threat, they were a force of nature. Fast, ruthless, tactical. Their arrival would reshape everything. But that's a story for another night. For now, remember this: the forest was no longer enough to hide in. The rivers no longer connected, now they divided. And the brothers who once stood shoulder to shoulder were now enemies on separate thrones. The golden age of Kievan Rus had ended not with a collapse, but with 1,000 quiet cracks. And sometimes it's the silence before the scream that stays with you. Ashes and horses. The Mongol invasion and the fall of Kyiv. I read once, maybe it was in a history book I borrowed from the town library, that the Mongols didn't just defeat armies. They erased them. They didn't conquer cities. They unmade them. And that's exactly what they did to Rus. It began like a whisper. Traders spoke of horsemen far to the east. Travelers told stories of entire towns, swallowed by fire and wind. By the 1220s, the Mongols had already smashed through Central Asia. Then came the probing attacks. In 1223, the princes of Rus gathered to meet the threat. They rode out to the Kalka River, a united front for once. But the Mongols weren't just warriors. They were tacticians. They feigned retreat. The Rus forces followed, broke formation, and were annihilated. Most of the princes who had ridden into battle never returned. But that was just the warning shot. The Mongols vanished after that first clash, almost like a storm passing over. For a decade, Rus returned to its usual chaos. Bickering princes divided lands, short-lived truces. They thought the danger had passed, but storms circle back. In 1237 they came in force. Led by Batu Khan, the grandson of Genghis himself, the Mongol horde rolled west like thunder on horseback. City after city fell. Ryazan destroyed in days. Vladimir burned, Suzdal leveled, and then came Kyiv. I once saw a medieval map that had Kyiv marked with a golden cross. The mother of Rus cities, it was called. A city of cathedrals and bells, of markets and manuscripts. But when the Mongols came in 1240, that cross might as well have been a target. The siege lasted days. The defense was desperate, but it didn't matter. The Mongols breached the walls, and Kyiv was swallowed in fire. Most of the city's inhabitants were slaughtered. Churches collapsed. Libraries burned. For years after, travelers wrote of bones piled in the streets and silence hanging over ruins that once rang with song. Russia didn't fall that day, but it changed forever. What followed wasn't occupation in the usual sense. The Mongols didn't settle in Rus. They didn't build palaces or rewrite laws. They ruled from afar, from Sarai, on the Volga River, capital of the Golden Horde. They let the princes stay on their thrones. But those thrones now came with strings. Every Rus prince had to travel to the Mongol court to be confirmed in power. That journey, called going to the horde, was as much humiliation as it was ritual. They brought gifts. They bowed low. They paid tribute, sometimes in silver, sometimes in blood. But the Mongols were clever overlords. They didn't micromanage. They didn't force their language or religion. They let the Orthodox Church remain. In fact, they exempted it from taxes, making the Church richer and more loyal than ever before. And that loyalty mattered. Because in this new order, the Mongols picked favorites. Among all the squabbling princes, one principality stood out: Moscow. At the time, Moscow was small, just a patch of forest and river. But its princes were shrewd. They paid their tribute on time. They kept order. And most importantly, they didn't rebel. In return, the Mongols gave them something priceless: the title of Grand Prince. That title meant they got to collect tribute from other Rus lands. They became the middlemen of empire. And so Moscow grew, not by conquest, but by accounting. Meanwhile, other cities suffered. Tver rose for a moment, then was crushed. Novgorod resisted Mongol influence, holding on to its vetch and civic pride, but even they sent envoys with gold. For over a century, Rus lived under what historians now call the Mongol yoke. But it wasn't just a burden. It was a forge. The Mongols reshaped Rus politics. They centralized power. They taught administration, census-taking, tax collection. In a strange way, they made the chaos of fractured Rus more organized, but always at a cost. There's a passage in the tale of the destruction of Ryazan, written years after the sack. It describes mothers throwing their children into wells rather than see them taken. It speaks of cities without bells, of winters without warmth. That memory of fire, of tribute, of submission, seeped into the Russian soul. It became more than history. It became inheritance. By the end of the 1200s, the old Kievan dream was gone. Kyiv still stood barely, but it was no longer the heart. That heart now beat in the forests of the northeast, in Moscow, in the shadows. Quiet, waiting. Because even under the Mongols, Russia had not forgotten who it was. And one day, it would rise again. From ashes to icons. The Rise of Moscow and the Orthodox Soul. I once read in a book buried deep in the stacks of a university library that Russia has always grown in silence. Not with drums or parades, but with patience. And nowhere is that truer than in the story of Moscow. After the Mongols leveled Kyiv and scattered the old order, Moscow began its quiet ascent. It was not the oldest city, not the largest, not even the most beautiful. But it had something that mattered more: location loyalty and luck. Nestled among rivers, forests, and trade routes, Moscow was easy to defend and easier to tax. Its princes knew how to play the long game. They paid tribute to the Mongols. They kept peace among the rival cities, and most importantly, they courted the Church. In 1325, the Metropolitan of the Orthodox Church moved his seat from Vladimir to Moscow. That was more than just real estate. It was a declaration. Moscow, once just another outpost in the woods, was becoming a spiritual heart. And with faith came power. Icons, those sacred images of Christ and the saints, began to fill the walls of Moscow's churches. Painted in gold and red, lit by flickering candlelight, they weren't just art. They were a window into something deeper, a world where Russia wasn't crushed by the Mongols, but chosen to suffer, a kind of sacred endurance. I remember watching a documentary late one night, grainy footage, quiet narration, and it showed a tiny wooden chapel in a Russian village. Inside, an icon of the Virgin Mary had survived fire, flood, even war. And the old woman lighting candles before it whispered, "She weeps for us, and we weep for her." That was Moscow's power. Not walls, not armies, belief. The princes of Moscow understood that. They didn't just collect taxes. They collected myths. They styled themselves as defenders of the faith. And in a land shattered by Mongol raids and princely feuds, that faith became the glue. But politics was never far behind. Ivan the Barbarian, known as Ivan Kalita, or Moneybags, ruled from 1325 to 1340. He wasn't a warrior. He was an accountant with a long view. He made Moscow the chief tax collector for the Golden Horde. Other cities hated him for it, called him a traitor. But the Mongols trusted him, and that trust meant more silver, more soldiers, more land. Ivan didn't conquer with swords. He bought loyalty with coin, and that coin built walls, stronger walls, stone walls. The original wooden Kremlin was replaced brick by brick into something firmer, taller, more permanent. Moscow was no longer just a town. It was becoming a fortress. By the mid-1300s, the winds were shifting. The Golden Horde was still powerful, but cracks were forming. Internal rivalries, succession disputes, and beyond the steppe, the Black Death was sweeping across Asia and Europe, leaving cities hollow and fields untouched by plow. Even in Russia the plague came. Villages vanished, monasteries emptied, but somehow Moscow endured, not untouched but less shattered than others. Some said it was divine protection, others said it was luck, or maybe just the rivers. During this time, Russian chronicles began to whisper of a new idea, that Moscow was not just a city, it was the city, the third Rome. The first Rome had fallen to barbarians. The second Constantinople had fallen to heresy, and soon the Turks. But Moscow would not fall. It would carry the light of orthodoxy, the true faith. It would suffer, yes, but it would endure. And this belief, half prayer, half prophecy, gave Russia something it had not had in generations of future. You could feel it in the monasteries that sprang up like mushrooms in the forests, in the bells that rang through fog and pine, in the pilgrims who walked barefoot for miles just to kneel before an icon, eyes full of tears. You could even feel it in the silence between wars. For most of the 1300s, Moscow didn't make big moves. It bided time. It watched the horde weaken. It waited for the right moment to rise, and that moment was coming. But for now, Russia still lived in shadow. Tribute still flowed east. Princes still knelt before khans. But in Moscow, a fire had been lit. Not the kind that burns cities. The kind that burns quietly, steadily, until it's ready to roar. And all around in the forests and the fields, People began to whisper, Moscow will lead us. Not today, not tomorrow, but soon, very soon. The Gathering Storm, Dmitry Donskoy, and the Battle for Russian Spirit. I once saw a painting in an old church museum. It showed a boy in armor, barely more than a teenager, riding a white horse across a battlefield. His eyes weren't fierce. They were calm, steady, like he already knew the story would be told for centuries. That boy was Dmitry Donskoy, and his story marks the moment Russia first stopped bowing and started standing. Dmitry was born in 1350, and by the time he was a young man, Moscow was already rising. The Mongols still ruled, yes, but their grip was weakening. Their khans fought among themselves. Their demands for tribute grew heavier, but their power to enforce it was starting to slip. Dmitry watched all of it carefully. He knew the day would come when someone would have to say no. In 1380, that moment arrived. The Mongol commander Mamai, one of the Golden Horde's most ambitious warlords, gathered his forces. He was determined to remind the Rus who was boss. Dmitry gathered his own troops, calling upon princes and warriors from across the fractured Russian lands. Some answered the call, others didn't, but enough came, and together they marched to a place called Kulikovo Field. It was September. The sky already smelled like winter. The land was flat open, exposed, a place where there would be no tricks, no hiding, just one army facing another. Dmitry wore plain armor that day, nothing to mark him as prince. He didn't want his men to shield him. He wanted to fight beside them. And when the two forces clashed, it was chaos, swords, arrows, horses crashing into each other. The chronicles say the battle raged for hours. Dust and blood filled the air. The Don River ran dark. But when it was over, Dmitry had won. Russia had won. It was the first real victory against the Mongols in more than a century. Not a rebellion, not a skirmish, a stand, a message. We are not your servants. Now the Mongols would return. Vengeance never sleeps, and they would crush Moscow again in 1382. But something had changed at Kulikovo. The fear had cracked. Dmitry came to be called Donskoy, of the Don, to honor where he had stood. I remember reading in a travel diary once written by an English merchant in the 1600s that Russian peasants still lit candles on the anniversary of that battle, even long after the names had faded. They didn't remember the tactics or the speeches, just that it was the day someone stood up, and that was enough. After Dmitry, Moscow's rulers grew bolder. Tribute to the horde continued, but with gritted teeth. The princes began to act more like kings, building stronger walls, marrying for politics, not just love, writing laws, collecting taxes not in the name of khans, but in their own. The Orthodox Church, too, began to shift its weight. It wasn't just spiritual anymore. It was political. The Church backed Moscow, not because it was perfect, but because it was strong. And in a land of chaos, strength meant survival. In 1389, Dmitry died, still young, but already a legend. His son Vasily the Fern took the throne. And while Vasily didn't ride into legendary battles, he did something just as important. He consolidated power. He married Sophia of Lithuania, tying Moscow to one of the region's most powerful kingdoms. He played the khans against each other, and when the chance came to stop paying tribute, he took it, then gave it again, then took it back. It was a dance, forward, back, advance, retreat. But always inch by inch, Moscow was rising, and across the land people began to whisper something new. We are no longer many Russias. We are one. Of course, it wasn't that simple. Rival cities still plotted. Foreign powers still threatened. The Mongols weren't gone. But the shift was happening not just in politics, but in hearts. People no longer saw themselves as scattered tribes. They saw themselves as Rus, as one people with one center, and that center was Moscow. In those years, new monasteries sprang up, not just for prayer, but for power. Monks copied texts, taught children, advised princes. They were the keepers of memory and the shapers of identity. Icons now, more detailed and expressive than ever, filled chapels. Stories of saints who suffered, who stood against tyranny, who endured the impossible. Those stories became mirrors, symbols, echoes of a national soul. It was as if the people of Russia were learning to believe again, not just in God, in themselves. And through it all, the snow kept falling. The rivers froze and thawed. The forests whispered to themselves. But the silence was changing, because beneath it, a storm was building. And soon one prince would rise, who would no longer kneel to any Khan. His name was Ivan, and he would be the first to call himself Grozny. But that story we'll tell tomorrow night. The Man Who Stopped. Kneeling Ivan the Great and the Rise of Sovereignty. You ever watch someone grow into their name? Ivan wasn't called the Great when he was born. Back in 1440, he was just Ivan Vasilievich, a boy born into the halls of Moscow, with a father who ruled but didn't quite reign. The kind of prince who still sent gold to the horde, who still flinched when a Khan sent a messenger. But Ivan watched. He listened. And as he grew, so did Moscow. When he was just 10, his father died. And at that age, a crown isn't a gift, it's a burden. Ivan was surrounded by advisors, guardians, and rivals. But something in him hardened early. Maybe it was the cold. Maybe it was the weight of his lineage. Or maybe, like some old souls, he just knew what he was meant to do. He wasn't loud. He wasn't flashy. But he didn't kneel. Over the decades that followed, Ivan began shaping Moscow into something new. He wasn't just collecting taxes. He was collecting lands. Through diplomacy, marriage, inheritance, and when needed, force, Ivan absorbed city after city. Tver, Rostov, Yaroslavl, Novgorod. That one was a prize, an old rival, a republic that prided itself on independence and trade. But Ivan moved slow and struck fast. By the late 1470s, Novgorod was under Moscow's heel, and Ivan stood taller. But there was still the Mongol shadow. Even with the Golden Horde fracturing, its pieces still demanded tribute. And in 1480, one of those pieces, the Great Horde, pushed its luck. The Khan sent messengers, demanded payment, demanded submission, and Ivan said no. He gathered his army, and the Khan gathered his. They met on the banks of the Ugra River. Now here's the thing, they never fought. For weeks, the two armies stared across the water, waiting, watching. The standoff dragged into October. The frost began to bite. And then, the horde retreated. No arrows fired, no swords drawn. But it was a victory all the same. Because for the first time in 240 years, Russia had defied the horde and not been crushed. They called it the Great Stand on the Ugra. And it wasn't just a military moment. It was psychological, a clean break. After that, Moscow paid no more tribute, no more kowtowing, no more fear. Ivan had severed the cord. He began to style himself, not just Grand Prince, but sovereign of all Russia. That word sovereign meant something. It meant no higher master, no foreign overlord. It was a declaration. We are our own power now. And he made it visible. Ivan rebuilt the Kremlin, not just as a fortress, but as a statement. With thick red walls, glittering churches, and Italian architects brought in to give it grandeur. The heart of Russia now had a face. He took the double-headed eagle as a symbol borrowed from the Byzantines. One head looked east, the other west. a reminder that Russia stood between worlds and belonged to neither. And most controversially, he married Sophia Paleologina. She was the niece of the last Byzantine emperor, a princess without a throne. But in marrying her, Ivan claimed not just a wife, but a legacy. He hinted that Moscow was now the third Rome, the heir to Christian civilization after Rome, and Constantinople had fallen. Some called it bold, others called it blasphemous. But Ivan didn't blink. He wasn't building a kingdom anymore. He was building a civilization. Still, greatness doesn't mean perfection. Ivan's rule was harsh. His court was suspicious, his punishments severe. Nobles who opposed him often found themselves removed. He centralized power, clipped the wings of the boyars, and left no room for dissent. His justice was swift, sometimes poetic, sometimes cruel, but it worked. When he died in 1505, Russia was unrecognizable from the land he'd inherited. No longer a patchwork of feuding states, no longer a tributary to foreign rulers. It was a unified state, and at its center stood Moscow, fortified, confident, and ready for the next storm. I once read in a journal by a German ambassador who visited Moscow in those years. He wrote that Ivan walked like a man whose ancestors still whispered in his ear, that he paused before answering, not because he was slow, but because he calculated everything. Maybe that's what greatness is, not genius, but the patience to build something that outlives you. And Ivan did. But while Ivan brought order, his grandson would bring something else entirely. He would inherit the throne young, just like Ivan did, but he wouldn't be calm or calculating. They would call him Ivan the Terrible. But that is a story for another night. Ivan the Terrible crowned with thunder. Do you remember that boy in school, the quiet one, kept to himself, didn't talk much? But you just knew something was simmering under the surface. Ivan was that boy. He was crowned Grand Prince of Moscow at 3 years old. Not even old enough to pronounce the word Tsar, but already wearing its weight, like a winter coat that didn't fit yet. After his father Vasily III died in 1533, the boy was technically ruler. But in practice, Russia was ruled by regents, power-hungry nobles, rival clans, men who smiled in public and poisoned in private. And while they fought for control, Ivan was left alone, neglected, forgotten, sometimes even abused. He spent his childhood in the shadowed halls of the Kremlin, watching, listening, learning that no one could be trusted, that love was conditional, and that power was the only language anyone respected. And then came 1547. Ivan was 16, and this time he didn't just accept the crown of Grand Prince. He declared himself Tsar of all Russia, not Prince, Tsar, derived from Caesar. It was more than a title, it was a signal, a declaration that Russia was now an empire, that its ruler wasn't just first among nobles, but something closer to a Roman emperor, anointed by God, accountable to no one but heaven itself. The coronation was grand. Churches rang their bells, crowds cheered, and for a moment, it looked like a new dawn. Ivan married Anastasia Romanovna, a noble woman of calm demeanor and sharp mind. He surrounded himself with reformers and visionaries. He created the first Zemsky Sobor, a national assembly, established new legal codes, reorganized the army, centralized administration. Even peasants for a time thought he might be different. A czar who saw beyond the boyars. A czar who might actually care. But tragedy waits in every corner. In 1560, Anastasia died suddenly, painfully. Poison was suspected. Ivan was shattered. She had been his anchor, his compass, his one true comfort. And with her gone, something broke. He changed, not like a leaf turning color in the fall, more like iron snapping under frost. He withdrew, grew paranoid, convinced the Boyars had murdered her, convinced that betrayal was everywhere and that the only way to rule was with terror. So he created the Oprichnina, a state within the state, a black-robed secret police who rode black horses and carried out Ivan's will with grim precision. They wore dogs' heads on their saddles and broomsticks on their backs to sniff out treason and sweep it away. And they did. Whole towns were burned. Nobles were arrested, tortured, executed. The city of Novgorod, accused of plotting with enemies, was ravaged. Thousands died. One chronicler wrote that the streets ran red for days. Ivan didn't just punish rebellion. He preempted it. He governed through fear, not as a side effect, but as policy. And yet, in the midst of this brutality, he remained an enigma. He wrote sermons, letters to foreign rulers. He debated theology. He opened contact with England, inviting trade and correspondence with Queen Elizabeth ussr. He wasn't mad in the way stories make madmen. He was brilliant and broken, and both at once. Then in 1581 came one of history's most chilling moments. Ivan, raging at his pregnant daughter-in-law for her attire, struck her. She miscarried. His son Ivan Ivanovich confronted him, and in the heat of fury Ivan struck him too, with his staff. So hard the young man collapsed, so hard he died. There's a famous painting by Ilya Repin, Ivan the Terrible and his son. You've probably seen it. Ivan cradling his son's bleeding body, eyes wide with horror, hands trembling. It didn't happen on canvas. It happened in real life, and Ivan never recovered. The son he trusted, the heir he prepared, gone by his own hand. He lived another 3 years more, withdrawn, more haunted. He died in 1584 during a game of chess. They say he slumped forward in his chair, quiet, heavy, like a man finally sinking beneath a weight he had carried too long. Ivan left behind a complicated legacy. He expanded Russia's territory dramatically into Kazan, Astrakhan, Siberia. He created systems that would define the Russian state for centuries, but he also sowed mistrust. He shattered the nobility. He ruled by terror and died alone. You know, I once read a line in a diary from a foreign envoy. To understand Russia, you must understand Ivan. He is not one man, but all of them at once, cruel and kind, pious and bloodthirsty, a child who never truly left the shadows. And in the ashes of his reign, Russia entered a time without guidance, a time of hunger, of war, of impostors. They called it the time of troubles, and I'll tell you about it in the next chapter. The time of troubles, when the throne was empty. I remember once during a blackout, my grandfather lit a candle and said, "Now you'll know what it felt like when no one was in charge." He was talking about this time when Russia had a throne, but no one to sit on it. It began in 1598 when Ivan the Terrible's son, Fyodor, died. Fyodor had ruled since 1584, but he wasn't really a ruler. Gentle, pious, more interested in prayers than politics. Some said he wasn't fit to rule. Others said he never wanted to. His death ended the Rurik dynasty. That family had ruled Russia for over 700 years. And now, silence. Power passed to Boris Godunov, Fyodor's brother-in-law. He wasn't of royal blood, but he was clever, educated, and had essentially run the country behind the scenes during Fyodor's reign. For a moment, it looked like Boris might stabilize things. He was crowned Tsar in 1598, the first Russian Tsar, not of Rurik descent. But legitimacy is a tricky thing. The people murmured, the boyars whispered, and then came the omen, a famine. From 1601 to 1603, the skies darkened, Crops failed, the ground froze too soon, and famine swept across the land like a ghost in winter. It wasn't just hunger, it was despair. People ate bark, leather. Some even turned to cannibalism. Hundreds of thousands died, and through it all, rumors spread that Boris had murdered young Dmitry, the youngest son of Ivan the Terrible, years ago, that the famine was divine punishment, that Dmitry had survived, that he was coming back. And then, in 1604, he did, or at least someone claimed to be him. A man appeared in Poland, educated, charismatic, said he was Dmitry, said he had escaped the assassination attempt, said he was the rightful heir. They called him the false Dmitry, and he had backers, Polish nobles, Catholic clergy, Cossack warriors. He marched on Moscow, and Boris died suddenly in 1605. His son briefly took the throne, but within weeks he was overthrown and killed. The false Dmitry was crowned. Russia now had a Tsar again, but he didn't last. He married a Polish noblewoman, surrounded himself with foreigners, took communion the Catholic way. The Orthodox clergy bristled. The boyars grew restless. A year later, in 1606, he was dragged from the Kremlin, shot, stabbed, and his body burned. The ashes were stuffed into a cannon and fired toward Poland. After that, the country descended into chaos. No one knew who was in charge. There were more impostors' men claiming to be yet another Dmitry or another long-lost heir. There were peasant uprisings, foreign invasions. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth occupied Moscow. Swedes invaded from the north. Cossacks roamed the countryside. Bandits took towns. At one point, there were 3 men claiming to be Tsar at the same time. It was like a dream you can't wake from, where the walls shift, the floor disappears, and no one remembers what normal even looked like. People called it the time of troubles, and it was. But even in that darkness, there was something stirring. In 1611, a movement began, not from the nobles or the church, but from the people. Merchants, blacksmiths, farmers, former soldiers. They formed a volunteer army, not to take power, but to restore it, to reclaim Moscow, to end the chaos. It was led by a butcher's son from Nizhny Novgorod, Kuzma Minin, and a prince, Dmitry Požarsky, an unlikely pair. But history loves its contrasts. Together they marched to Moscow in 1612. They drove out the Poles, liberated the Kremlin, reclaimed the heart of Russia. And then came the question that had haunted the land for 15 years. Who would be Tsar? This time, the people chose. They gathered in 1613, nobles, clergy, citizens, and they elected a 16-year-old boy. His name was Mikhail Romanov. His family had been persecuted under Ivan. His father was a respected cleric, and he was seen as young enough, pure enough, and disconnected enough from the blood-soaked chaos to represent a new beginning. He was crowned Tsar in July of that year, and with him began a dynasty, one that would last 300 years, from 1613 to 1917, the Romanovs. I once read in an old history book that Russia doesn't transition, it collapses, then rebuilds, that it doesn't evolve gradually, but swings like a pendulum between extremes. This was one of those swings, from chaos to order, from ashes to empire. The troubles were over, but the consequences lingered. Mistrust of outsiders, fear of rebellion. The idea that only strong rule, autocratic, unyielding, could hold Russia together. You could still feel it even centuries later, like a scar across the pages of history. But for now at least, the throne had a name again, and Russia had a future. The rise of the Romanovs. A boy becomes a dynasty. I once asked my uncle how a 16-year-old boy could rule a country as vast and broken as Russia. He laughed and said He did not rule, he endured. And sometimes that's all a country needs. When Mikhail Romanov was crowned in 1613, Russia was not a country. It was a bruise, a wound wrapped in snow. 15 years of chaos had left it fractured, exhausted, and wary of anyone who wanted the throne. But Mikhail did not ask for it. In fact, he had to be convinced, begged really to accept the crown. He was hiding with his mother in a monastery when they found him. He wept when they told him he had been chosen. He was young, inexperienced, a survivor of trauma, not a maker of power. And maybe that's exactly what Russia needed. In the early years, his father Filaret returned from Polish captivity and became Patriarch of Moscow. While Mikhail held the crown, Filaret held the reins. Together they rebuilt, brick by brick, law by law. The first Romanovs did not conquer. They healed. They re-established order, reformed the military, reclaimed lost territories, reopened trade. Slowly people returned to the cities. Crops were planted again. Roads were cleared. Bells rang from church towers that had been silent for years. There was no magic, just time and patience. And maybe that's the real miracle. But even peace has its shadows. Taxes remained high. Serfdom, the binding of peasants to land and lord, hardened into law. In 1649, a legal code was passed that locked serfs into their status for life. No more running, no more appeals. A man was tied to his master like bark to a tree. It was called the sobernoye ulozenie. And while it brought clarity and consistency to Russian law, it also deepened the divide between rich and poor. Still, the Romanovs endured. After Mikhail, his son Alexis took the throne in 1645. Now, here was a man who ruled. Alexis was devout, so devout they called him the most gentle Tsar. But don't let the nickname fool you. He passed reforms that touched everything church, state, army, culture. He expanded Russia's borders, crushed rebellions, fought wars with Poland and the Crimean Khanate. And in 1654, something remarkable happened. Russia absorbed eastern Ukraine. The Cossacks, those fierce, semi-independent warriors along the Dnieper River, pledged loyalty to the Russian Tsar. It was a major shift, and it brought Russia face to face with Poland and the Ottoman Empire. Once again, Russia was no longer just recovering, it was growing. But not everyone grew with it. In 1662, the copper riot broke out in Moscow. The government had issued copper coins to pay soldiers, but inflation soared and prices tripled. Ordinary people couldn't afford bread. They gathered, shouted, demanded change. Soldiers fired into the crowd. Order returned, but so did fear. Then came the church schism. In the mid-1600s, Patriarch Nikon, Alexis's close advisor, decided to reform the Russian Orthodox Church. The old rituals, he claimed, were full of errors. Cross yourself with 3 fingers, not 2. Spell Jesus a different way. Align with Greek customs. To outsiders, these might sound like minor adjustments, but to the faithful, it was heresy. People tore their garments, burned their books, fled into the forests. They became known as the Old Believers. They believed they were preserving the true path. The government called them rebels. Thousands were imprisoned, tortured, burned at the stake. It was a religious civil war, fought not with armies, but with prayer and fire. Even today, some Old Believer communities still exist, still whispering their prayers in the old tongue, still crossing themselves the old way. It's a reminder that in Russia, history never really disappears. It just goes quiet for a while. In 1676, Alexis died. His reign had lasted 31 years longer than any Tsar before him, and what he left behind was complicated. A larger, stronger Russia, yes, but also a country divided between the rich and poor, the Orthodox, and the old believers, the rulers, and the ruled. He had 3 sons. 2 would become Tsar. 1 would change the world, but not yet. For now, the Romanov name was no longer a question mark. It was an institution. And though Russia's heart still beat unevenly, it beat. Once again, I think back to that candlelit night with my uncle. He said, "You know, Russia is not a story of kings. It's a story of surviving kings." And maybe that's what the Romanovs understood, that in a land of blizzards and betrayals, the first task of a ruler is simply to last. The dual Tsars, Ivan and Peter, and the woman who ruled them. I once heard someone say that Russia is always ruled by the strongest person in the room, whether they wear a crown or not. And for this chapter of Russia's story, the strongest person was not a Tsar. It was a woman, a sister, a survivor. But let's start at the beginning. When Tsar Alexis died in 1676, his eldest son Fyodor became Tsar. But Fyodor was sickly, frail, and plagued by health problems. He ruled for just 6 years before passing away without an heir. Now the real drama began. There were 2 remaining sons, both technically eligible to become Tsar. Ivan was older but mentally and physically disabled. Peter was younger, just 10 years old, but healthy, sharp, and energetic. And they had different mothers. Ivan's mother came from the powerful Miloslavsky family. Peter's mother came from the ambitious Narishkins. Suddenly, the throne wasn't just about a boy. It was about bloodlines, alliances, factions. The nobility was divided. In 1682, the tension exploded. A regiment of elite soldiers called the Streltsy stormed the Kremlin, furious at rumors that Ivan had been bypassed. In the chaos, boyars were thrown from windows. Blood ran through the courtyards. And standing above it all was a woman named Sofia. Sofia Alexeyevna, daughter of Alexis, sister to both Ivan and Peter. She was smart, educated, politically savvy. And in that moment, she made her move. To calm the unrest, she proposed a compromise. Both Ivan and Peter would rule jointly as co-tsars. Ivan as the senior, Peter as the junior. But neither boy could govern, so Sofia would be the regent. For 7 years, she ruled from behind a curtain, literally. At state functions, the Tsars sat on the throne while she spoke through a special opening in the wall. Her voice echoed, but her face remained hidden. Power without presence. But make no mistake, she ruled. She negotiated with foreign powers, reformed the army, supported education and science. And she tried desperately to maintain balance in a court boiling with rivalry. But there was one problem. Peter. Even as a child, Peter was different. He didn't like court ceremonies. He preferred the cannon yards, the ship docks, the foreign quarter of Moscow. He built wooden forts and mock armies, played at war with friends who would one day become real generals. He was watching, learning, waiting. By 1689, he was 17, and he was ready. A power struggle erupted. Sofia, sensing a threat, tried to rally the Streltsy again, but this time they hesitated. Peter struck first. With the support of the army, he seized control of Moscow. Sofia was arrested and sent to a convent. She would spend the rest of her life behind monastery walls, her name whispered, her power erased. Ivan remained co-tsar, in name only, until his death in 1696. But from that moment in 1689, Russia had a new master, Peter. And if you think the last chapters were wild, just wait. Because Peter wasn't just a czar, he was a storm. Peter the Great, the Tsar, who turned Russia westward. You ever meet someone who refuses to sit still, who talks big moves fast, and drags everyone else into their orbit, whether they like it or not? That was Peter. Peter the Great wasn't just a ruler. He was a force, a whirlwind in a tricorn hat. and from the moment he took the reins of power, he didn't walk, he marched. But first, he traveled. In 1697, just a year after officially becoming sole Tsar, Peter did something no Russian monarch had ever done. He left. Disguised as a common laborer using the name Sergeant Pyotr Mikhailov, he joined a delegation known as the Grand Embassy and toured Europe in secret. Holland, England, Austria. He studied shipbuilding in Dutch yards, examined artillery in Prussian arsenals, peered through telescopes, watched parliaments debate, visited museums and printing presses, and what he saw left a mark. Russia, he decided, was backward, isolated, medieval. He was going to change that. When Peter returned to Moscow in 1698, he came home a different man, with new clothes, new ideas, and a pair of scissors in hand. First thing he did, he cut the beards off his nobles, literally. He believed beards were a symbol of the old ways of religious conservatism and resistance to progress. So he banned them. Those who refused had to pay a beard tax and carry a token that said beard tax paid. Imagine that pockets jingling, not with coins, but with proof that you were allowed to be old-fashioned. And that was just the beginning. Peter overhauled nearly everything. He reformed the calendar, shifting Russia from the old Byzantine style to the Julian system. He built factories, schools, a navy, Russia's first true navy, crafted with his own hands. He changed the alphabet, modernized the army, introduced state service requirements for nobles, founded the Russian Academy of Sciences. And then, he built a city. Not just any city. In 1703, on a mosquito-infested swamp by the Baltic Sea, Peter ordered the construction of what would become his crown jewel, St. Petersburg. He called it Russia's window to the West. Others called it madness. Tens of thousands of peasants were forced into labor. They dug canals, hauled stone, died by the thousands. But Peter didn't care. He wanted stone palaces like Paris canals, like Amsterdam, and a port that faced Europe, not Asia. In 1712, he made St. Petersburg the new capital. Moscow, the old heart of Russia, was sidelined. The message was clear: the future was not backward-looking. But Peter wasn't done. He went to war. The Great Northern War, 1700-1721, against Sweden, then a major power, became the proving ground for Peter's reforms. At first, Russia was humiliated. In the Battle of Narva, Swedish, King Charles XIII crushed Peter's army. But Peter learned, adapted, built new armies, new ships, new strategies, and in 1709, at the Battle of Poltava, he struck back. The Swedish forces were decisively defeated. Russia had arrived. By the end of the war, Russia had control of the Baltic coast. It was no longer a landlocked giant. It was an empire. In 1721, Peter took a new title, Emperor of all Russia. He had reshaped the nation from beards to battleships, alphabets to architecture. But the man himself, he remained restless. He drank heavily, slept little, demanded much. There's a story I once read, maybe true, maybe folklore, that Peter once saved a group of drowning sailors. He dove into freezing water and pulled them out one by one. A heroic moment. But he caught pneumonia and never fully recovered. In 1725, Peter the Great builder, reformer, warrior, died at the age of 52. His final words, scrawled in a shaky hand, were said to be, "Leave everything to." And then the pen dropped. No one knows what he meant to say, what he wanted to leave, who was meant to take his place. What we do know is this: by the time he was gone, Russia was no longer the same country he inherited. It was bigger, stronger, stranger, and it would never go back. Catherine the Great Enlightenment in an iron corset. There's a certain kind of power that doesn't shout. It smiles, it writes letters, it learns languages, and then when the time is right, it rewrites the future. That was Catherine. Born in 1729, as Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst, a minor German princess, she was never supposed to be empress of anything. But life, especially Russian life, doesn't always follow the script. She married into the Russian royal family at just 14, taking the name Catherine and converting to Orthodoxy. Her husband, Peter III, was awkward, cold, obsessed with toy soldiers and Prussian uniforms. They never got along. And when Peter became Tsar in 1762, he lasted just 6 months. 6. With the help of the military, and likely a quiet nod from many who believed she was the better ruler, Catherine staged a coup. Peter was arrested, then mysteriously died. No one asked too many questions. Catherine was now Empress of Russia, and she did not waste time. She was fluent in French, loved the Enlightenment, and kept a correspondence with Voltaire. Yes, that Voltaire. The man who once said, "If God did not exist, it would be necessary to invent him." She called him the greatest man of the century. He called her the Star of the North. But Catherine wasn't just writing letters. She was writing laws. She launched a massive codification project to modernize Russian legal codes. She flirted with constitutional ideas, even drafting a nakaz, or instruction, that spoke of liberty, equality before the law, and the importance of reason. It was idealistic, enlightened, very French. But it was also theoretical, because back in Russia, the reality was harder. Serfs were still bound to landowners. The nobility still ruled the countryside like little kings, and rebellions brewed. The biggest came in 1773, the Pugachev Rebellion. A Cossack named Yemelyan Pugachev claimed to be Peter III, not dead after all, but back to reclaim his throne and liberate the people. Tens of thousands joined him. Peasants, Cossacks, dissidents. They stormed fortresses, killed nobles, and for a moment, it looked like they might succeed. But Catherine crushed the rebellion, swiftly, brutally. Afterward, she abandoned much of her talk about freeing the serfs. Enlightenment had its limits. Still, she continued to push forward. Catherine expanded education, built new schools, supported the arts, founded the Hermitage Museum, patronized painters, architects, philosophers. She brought European culture to the Russian court and Russian ambition to European politics. Territorially, she was relentless. Under her rule, Russia gained vast new lands: Crimea from the Ottoman Empire, eastern Poland through a series of partitions with Prussia and Austria, access to the Black Sea. She sent explorers to Alaska, colonists to Siberia, soldiers to war, and she had lovers, many lovers. The most famous was Grigory Potemkin, a brilliant general and administrator who helped her build cities and expand the empire. Their partnership was part romance, part statecraft. Some say they married in secret. Others say their bond was more pragmatic. But either way, it worked. There's even the old tale of the Potemkin villages, fake towns, built to impress Catherine during her tours. A symbol of illusion, of empire built on show. Whether true or not, it speaks to the contradictions of her reign. Catherine wanted to be a philosopher queen, a reformer, a civilizer, but she also ruled with an iron grip. She upheld serfdom, strengthened autocracy, used censorship when necessary, and never let go of power. When she died in 1796, after 34 years on the throne, Russia was larger, more European, and more powerful than it had ever been, but also more divided. The nobility had grown richer, the peasants poorer, the gap between ideals and realities wider. And yet, there's no question Catherine left her mark. She remains one of the most fascinating figures in Russian history, a woman in a man's world, mastering both the salon and the battlefield, the pen and the sword. I once read a line again from one of those old leather-bound histories that said Peter made Russia an empire. Catherine made it a power. Maybe that's true. She didn't burn like Peter. She shone. From Tsars to Napoleons, Russia in the age of revolutions. After Catherine the Great passed away in 1796, the Russian Empire stood tall and vast. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. The world was changing. New ideas were cracking the old order, and Russia, whether it wanted to or not, was about to face the whirlwind. Paul the Catherine's son took the throne. He was nothing like his mother. Paranoid, impulsive, obsessed with discipline and protocol. Paul reversed many of Catherine's reforms. He banned her books, changed succession laws, forced the army into strict Prussian-style uniforms that even the soldiers hated. He didn't trust the nobles, and they didn't trust him. In 1801, just 5 years into his reign, Paul was assassinated in a palace coup, some say, with the quiet approval of his own son, Alexander. And so Alexander I became Tsar. Young, charismatic, fluent in the language of Enlightenment, just like his grandmother Catherine. He promised reform, liberty, a new dawn. But the world had other plans, because in France a man named Napoleon Bonaparte had declared himself emperor. Napoleon wasn't just conquering land, he was conquering the very idea of monarchy. He swept through Europe like fire through dry grass, tearing down old systems, spreading revolutionary ideals, along with cannonballs. Russia watched, worried. At first, Alexander tried diplomacy. He even admired Napoleon a little. They met on a raft in 1807 at Tilsit, speaking like equals, carving up parts of Europe like chess pieces. But that alliance never sat well with Russians, or with Alexander himself. And by 1812, diplomacy had melted into war. Napoleon marched east with the largest army Europe had ever seen. Over 600,000 soldiers. French, Polish, German, Italian. He thought it would be quick. He thought Russia would fold. But Russia didn't fight like Europe. They didn't stand and clash in grand battles. They retreated. Again and again, drawing Napoleon deeper into the endless countryside, burning fields as they went, denying him food, fuel, shelter. It wasn't a war. It was a trap. When Napoleon reached Moscow, he found a city abandoned, silent. And then, on the first night, it caught fire. Some say it was deliberate Russian agents setting their own capital ablaze. Others say it was chaos. But the message was clear. Russia would not be conquered. Winter came. Fierce. Unforgiving. Napoleon's Grande Armée froze, starved, and bled all the way back to France. Fewer than 100,000 made it out. The invasion was over. Russia had done the impossible. Alexander returned to Europe a hero, the man who stood up to Napoleon. He marched triumphantly through Paris in 1814, helping to restore old monarchies and redraw borders at the Congress of Vienna. But something had changed in him. He grew more religious, more mystical, less interested in reform. By the end of his reign, Alexander was retreating not just from liberal ideas, but from life itself. He died mysteriously in 1825, far from the capital, in a town called Taganrog. Some whispered he hadn't died at all, that he had faked his death and become a wandering monk. Russian history has a way of turning rulers into legends. But back in St. Petersburg, a real crisis was unfolding. Because Alexander had no children, the succession was unclear. His brother Constantine had secretly declined the throne. Another brother, Nicholas, was next in line, but the public didn't know. And into that confusion stepped a group of young officers. They were idealists, veterans of the Napoleonic Wars. Men who had seen Europe, seen constitutions, parliaments, the possibility of change. They wanted reform, an end to autocracy, a Russia governed by laws, not decrees. On December 14, 1825, they gathered in Senate Square and declared their loyalty not to Nicholas, but to a constitution. It was bold, but disorganized. Nicholas acted swiftly. The rebellion was crushed in hours. Its leaders, later known as the Decembrists, were arrested, exiled to Siberia, or hanged. Nicholas I had learned his first lesson as Tsar: no mercy for dissent, and Russia once again tightened its grip. But the Decembrists had lit a spark. They were the first real modern revolutionaries in Russian history. They failed, but they planted an idea. That change was possible. That autocracy was not eternal. And somewhere in the frozen mines of Siberia, they kept that dream alive. Iron and Ink. Nicholas I. Censorship and the Shadow of Rebellion. After the gunfire faded from Senate Square in 1825, Nicholas I stood before his new empire with a grim sense of duty. He had not expected to be Tsar, not that day, not that way. But now that he was, he would make sure no one ever questioned Russia's throne again. Nicholas was not a man of poetry. He was a man of rules, discipline, hierarchy. Where his brother Alexander flirted with reform, Nicholas fortified the walls, against change, against doubt, against memory. He created what some would later call a gendarme of Europe, a regime that ruled not just with soldiers, but with silence. Censorship became state policy. Books, plays, even private letters were screened for dangerous ideas. A new department, the Third Section, acted as secret police watching, listening, reporting. No satire, no suspicion, no sympathy for revolution. I once read in a book on Russian literature that under Nicholas writers had to become acrobats balancing on a wire between truth and survival. What they could not say openly, they wrote in symbols, in shadows. And yet this was the era when Russian literature bloomed, because repression, strange as it sounds, can sometimes sharpen the pen. Pushkin, often called the father of modern Russian literature, walked this tightrope with grace. His stories carried coded defiance. His poetry stirred quiet rebellion. But Nicholas watched him closely. When Pushkin died in a duel in 1837, shot over a matter of honor, or perhaps politics, the Tsar personally approved the obituary. Then came Gogol. His dead souls painted a grotesque, absurd portrait of Russian bureaucracy. Funny, yes, but with a twist of despair. And later, Dostoevsky. Though still young in Nicholas's reign, he would be arrested in 1849 for his ties to a radical discussion group, sentenced to death, lined up before the firing squad, and then, at the very last moment, pardoned. A cruel trick staged by the Tsar himself to teach obedience. Dostoevsky never forgot it. He spent years in Siberia thinking, rebuilding, and what he would later write about guilt punishment. Grace was born there in the shadow of that frozen fear. Outside the world of books, Russia marched on. Nicholas industrialized where he could, railroads, mines, factories. But the empire was still mostly peasants, serfs, tied to the land, bound to nobles by law. He believed in autocracy, orthodoxy, and nationality. That was his motto. And he ruled with iron conviction. But conviction can blind a man. By the early 1850s, trouble was brewing in the distant south in Crimea. Russia had long claimed itself the protector of Orthodox Christians in the Ottoman Empire. When the Ottomans denied this claim, Nicholas saw it as a challenge. He moved troops, but what began as a small regional pressure quickly spiraled into a global war. France and Britain, fearing Russian expansion, sided with the Ottomans. The Crimean War had begun. It was a war of rifles and cholera, of wooden ships and iron shells, of outdated Russian logistics meeting modern European firepower, and the world watched. For the first time, thanks to the telegraph and war correspondence, people read daily updates about the siege of Sevastopol, about Florence Nightingale's work with the wounded, about the charge of the Light Brigade. Russia, proud and vast, was losing. Nicholas did not live to see the end. He died in 1855, possibly from pneumonia, possibly from heartbreak. Some said he had wanted to die, that the failure in Crimea crushed his belief that he was chosen to lead, that the world he built from rules and fear was not as strong as he thought. When he passed, his son, Alexander II, would take the throne, and with him, something else would rise. Hope, but we'll get there soon enough. For now, remember this: even in the coldest winters, ink still flows. Even under iron, stories survive. The Tsar Liberator Alexander II, and the end of serfdom. I once heard a historian say that in Russia every reform is born with a shadow. And in 1855, when Alexander II became Tsar, that shadow stood right behind him. He was 40, broad-shouldered, with a face that looked like it had seen too much winter and too little sunlight. But he was not his father. Alexander had watched Russia lose in Crimea, had seen soldiers fight with flintlocks against rifles, roads crumble under the weight of cannon, and noble pride bow to industrial firepower. He knew the empire needed change, and so change began. At the heart of it was one truth he could no longer ignore: serfdom had to go. For centuries, Russian peasants had been tied to the land like furniture, sold, inherited, beaten, their lives, not their own. And now, in the age of steam engines and telegraphs, it was becoming clear an empire built on bondage could not move forward. So in 1861, after years of debate and hesitation, Alexander issued the Emancipation Edict. Over 20 million serfs were declared free. I remember reading a letter from one peasant at the time. He wrote, "We were told we were free, but we were not told what that meant." And that captured it. Because yes, they were free, but without land, without tools, without money. Many stayed on the same estates now as tenants, paying rent to their former masters. Others wandered, hoping to find something better. Few did. Still, it mattered. It was the largest act of liberation in Europe since the end of feudalism. It cracked the old system open, and through that crack, more reform followed. Alexander restructured the courts, introduced local self-government through the zemstvos, allowed universities to breathe again, modernized the military, built railways, encouraged investment. For a moment it seemed Russia might change from within. But like I said, every reform has a shadow. Not everyone thought the changes were enough. Among the students and intellectuals, frustration grew. They saw emancipation as incomplete, the courts as still rigged, the Tsar as still too powerful. Some believed Russia needed not reform, but revolution. In the 1860s and 70s, a new movement began to rise. The Narodniks, those who go to the people. Young idealists who left cities to live among peasants, preaching socialism, hoping to awaken the masses. The peasants didn't understand them. Some turned them in, others ignored them. And when peaceful persuasion failed, a few radicals turned to violence, bombings, assassination attempts, secret plots. Alexander survived one, then another, and another. He changed his carriage routes, his guards, his routine. But still they came. I once saw a woodcut in a book of the Tsar, in his carriage, snow, falling, the shadow of a man stepping into the street. It felt quiet and doomed. On March 13, 1881, Alexander was returning to the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg when a bomb was thrown under his carriage. He survived. As he stepped out to check on the wounded, another man rushed forward. The second bomb tore his legs apart. Shrapnel pierced his body. Blood spilled across the cobblestones. He died within hours. That same day, he had signed a plan to create a national parliament, Russia's first steps toward constitutional monarchy. The paper was still on his desk, unsigned by anyone else. And so ended the life of the Tsar Liberator. His son Alexander III would take a very different path. But before we go there, remember, this reform in Russia is never just an idea. It is a gamble, a risk, and often a wound. Still, for one brief stretch of time, a Tsar tried to set his people free. And even if the chains didn't all fall off, they rattled. The reactionary Tsar Alexander III and the return of control. The palace grew quieter after his father died. The curtains were heavier, the guards more visible, the conversations shorter. Alexander III was not meant to rule like this. His older brother Nicholas had been groomed for the throne. But when illness took him, the burden shifted. And now, with blood still drying on the cobblestones where his father had fallen, Alexander made a choice. No more experiments. No more reforms. If Russia was to survive, it would do so under order. Iron order. I once heard a Russian scholar call him the Wall, because that's what he became. Immovable, unyielding, and cold. He grew a thick beard, broad shoulders, and an intolerance for anything that smelled like revolution. The first thing he did was tear up the plans for a parliament. Then he expanded the secret police, cracked down on universities, increased censorship, rolled back the power of the local governments his father had allowed. He believed in three things: orthodoxy, autocracy, nationality. That meant loyalty to the Russian Orthodox Church, absolute power of the Tsar, and the supremacy of Russian culture. If you were a Pole, a Jew, a Ukrainian, or anything other than Russian, this was the beginning of a hard time. Policies of Russification were enforced. People were told to speak Russian, worship like Russians, think like Russians, or be punished. Jews especially were targeted. Pogroms, violent riots broke out in towns and villages, homes burned, shops smashed, lives ruined. And the state did little to stop it. In fact, many suspected it encouraged the chaos, using Jews as scapegoats for the empire's anxieties. It was a dark season. And yet, beneath the weight of repression, something else was growing. Russia was modernizing. Alexander III was no fool. He believed in order, yes, but also in strength. He pushed for industrial development. Railways stretched across the empire. The Trans-Siberian Railway was begun under his reign, a ribbon of steel meant to bind together the frozen vastness of the East with the cities of the West. Coal mines opened. Steel factories roared. A new working class emerged. They lived in crowded tenements, worked 16-hour days, and earned barely enough to eat. But they were not bound to the land like the old serfs. They read newspapers, shared ideas, asked questions. And slowly, in the slums and smoke of St. Petersburg and Moscow, a new fire began to flicker. Marxist ideas found their way into pamphlets. Books were passed hand to hand. And somewhere in the provinces, a quiet boy named Vladimir was growing up watching all of this. His brother had been executed for plotting against the Tsar. The boy's name was Lenin. But that's for later. For now, the Tsar ruled with a heavy hand, and the people for the most part obeyed. Alexander III was not a warm man, but he was a stable one. He saw Europe drifting toward liberalism, revolution, even war, and he wanted none of it. In fact, it said he kept a small statue on his desk. A bear. Broad and strong. That was his vision of Russia. Not elegant, not clever, but powerful, enduring. He ruled for 13 years. Then one day in 1894 his health failed. Kidney disease brought on by years of stress and inherited weakness wore him down. He died at 50. His wife the Empress wept openly, and his son Nicholas stepped forward. Nicholas II, the last Tsar of Russia. He was 26, slim, kind-eyed, gentle in voice and nature, raised in privilege but unprepared for storms. Alexander III had ruled with a fist. Nicholas would try to rule with a heart. But in the Russia of the 20th century, hearts would not be enough. The last Romanov, Nicholas II, and the end of the dynasty. I once saw a photograph of Nicholas II taken in the early days of his reign. He looked so young, so neat. His mustache perfectly groomed his uniform, crisp medals gleaming. He looked like a man pretending to be a painting. But behind the glassy eyes, you could almost sense it, the doubt. He had not been trained to lead like his father had. He was quiet, polite, uncomfortable with confrontation. He loved his family dearly, doted on his wife Alexandra, and adored his 5 children, especially the youngest Alexei, his only son. But Russia did not need a father. It needed a ruler. And Nicholas, sweet hesitant Nicholas, was not made for the storm that was coming. His reign began under the shadow of change. The working class had grown restless. The intelligentsia whispered about revolution. The wounds of past pogroms still stung. The peasantry was still poor. The bureaucracy was bloated, and the court was frozen in time. His wife Alexandra, a German princess by birth, never quite won the hearts of the Russian people. She was seen as aloof, overly religious, and later dangerously close to a mystic named Rasputin. Ah, Rasputin. We'll get to him. But first, the year was 1904, and Russia was about to enter a war it could not win. It started far from home in the waters of the Pacific. Russia had imperial ambitions in the east. So did Japan. The two collided in Korea and Manchuria. And in 1905, at the Battle of Tsushima, the Russian Navy was obliterated by the Japanese. It was more than a military disaster. It was a national humiliation. Back home, anger brewed. In January of that year, workers in St. Petersburg gathered for a peaceful march. Led by a priest, Father Gapon, they carried icons and portraits of the Tsar. They believed truly that if they could only speak to Nicholas, he would help them. They never made it to the palace. Troops opened fire on the crowd. Dozens, maybe hundreds, were killed. It was called Bloody Sunday. And for the first time, the people's illusion of the Tsar as a benevolent little father shattered. Strikes broke out. Protests erupted. Revolution was in the air. Nicholas, rattled and reluctant, was forced to make concessions. He issued the October Manifesto, promising a constitution, civil liberties, and a national parliament, the Duma. But it was too little and too late. He never took the Duma seriously. He dissolved it when it disagreed with him. Power stayed in the palace while the streets seethed. Then came Rasputin, a wandering Siberian peasant, self-proclaimed holy man, rumored healer. Alexei, Nicholas's son, suffered from hemophilia, a bleeding disorder that nearly killed him more than once. Rasputin somehow seemed to ease his pain, and so Alexandra clung to him. He was strange, filthy, charismatic, dangerous. He gained influence at court, whispered advice in Alexandra's ear, offended the nobility, and fueled endless gossip. The people were scandalized. The church was outraged. The court was embarrassed. And Nicholas, always slow to act, did nothing. Then came World War I. In 1914, after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, Europe exploded into conflict. Russia joined the war on the side of the Allies, fighting Germany and Austria-Hungary. But Russia was not ready. Its soldiers lacked guns, boots, food. The front was a slaughterhouse. Millions died. Morale collapsed. And in 1915, Nicholas made a fateful choice. He took personal command of the army. That meant when things went wrong, and they did, the blame fell squarely on him. Back in Petrograd, formerly St. Petersburg, the capital boiled. Food shortages, inflation, strikes, protests. And Alexandra, left in charge during Nicholas's absence, trusted Rasputin more than ministers or generals. It was chaos wrapped in silence. In 1916, Rasputin was murdered, poisoned, shot, and drowned by nobles who feared his grip on the throne. But it was too late. By early 1917, the country was on the edge. In February, women marched for bread. Workers joined them, then soldiers, and suddenly revolution. Nicholas tried to return to the capital, but was stopped by rail workers. The Duma turned against him. His generals told him the army would no longer support him. And on March 15, 1917, in a railway carriage in Pskov, Nicholas II abdicated the throne. Just like that, 300 years of Romanov rule ended. He asked for no ceremony, no resistance. He just wanted peace. He was allowed to return to his family. They were placed under house arrest, first in the Alexander Palace, then moved to Tobolsk, deep in Siberia, and finally to a modest house in Ekaterinburg. They lived simply, prayed together, tried to stay hopeful. But the new government, weak, divided, led briefly by Alexander Kerensky, couldn't hold. And in October 1917, another revolution came, a darker one, and the Romanovs, already shadows, would soon vanish altogether. Red October, Lenin Revolution, and the birth of Soviet Russia. There's a painting I once saw in a dusty old history book. It showed Lenin standing atop an armored car arm, outstretched coat, flapping like a banner in the wind, as he addressed a sea of faces. Workers, soldiers, dreamers, all packed shoulder to shoulder in the twilight of 1917. It looked dramatic, heroic, almost theatrical. But the truth was messier, louder, and far more dangerous. Let's go back. March 1917 had brought revolution, spontaneous, hungry, desperate. Nicholas II was gone. A provisional government had taken his place, made up of moderates and liberals. Men like Alexander Kerensky tried to steer Russia toward a democratic future. But they kept the war going, and that, above all, was their fatal mistake. Because by the spring of 1917, Russians had no appetite left for war. Their sons were dead. Their food was gone. Their patience burned out. Enter Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov. You know him as Lenin, exiled for years, revolutionary since his youth, fanatical, brilliant, ruthless. He had watched the February Revolution unfold from Switzerland, frustrated and far from home. Then Germany, yes. The enemy offered him a sealed train car, safe passage through their borders. Why? Because they knew something that Kerensky didn't. Lenin would tear Russia apart from the inside. And he did. When Lenin arrived in Petrograd in April 1917, he electrified the revolutionary movement. He promised peace, land, and bread. He condemned the provisional government as a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. He demanded all power to the Soviets, those grassroots councils of workers and soldiers springing up everywhere. And he meant it. Lenin was not interested in gradual reform. He didn't want compromise. He wanted revolution. Now. By summer, tensions boiled over. There were strikes, clashes, the July days, an attempted uprising that fizzled, forcing Lenin to flee to Finland in disguise. The provisional government cracked down, arrested Bolsheviks, raided newspapers, called Lenin a traitor. But the damage was done. Then came Kornilov. General Lovor Kornilov, a conservative military man, tried to march on Petrograd in August, threatening to impose martial law. Kerensky panicked, and in a move that changed everything, he armed the Bolsheviks to defend the city. The coup failed. But now, the Bolsheviks were armed, legal, organized, and by October, they were ready. On the night of October 25th, 1917, Julian calendar, November 7th. By modern reckoning, while most of the city slept or shrugged, Lenin made his move. The Bolsheviks seized key buildings, bridges, and telegraph offices. The Winter Palace seat of the provisional government fell with barely a fight. The government was arrested, and Lenin at last stood before the Congress of Soviets and announced the dawn of a new world. A world ruled by workers. A world without czars, capitalists, or kings. Russia was now Soviet Russia. The world trembled, but seizing power is easier than holding it. What followed was not peace, but civil war. From 1918 to 1921, Russia descended into chaos. The Bolsheviks, now called the Reds, fought against a loose, chaotic alliance of monarchists, liberals, nationalists, and foreign invaders known as the Whites. Britain, France, the United States, they all sent troops, money, weapons. But they underestimated the Reds' discipline, their message, and above all, their willingness to use terror. Lenin created the Cheka, the secret police, to root out enemies. Executions became common. Churches were closed. Land was seized. The nobility, those who hadn't fled, were swept away. And in July 1918, in the basement of a house in Ekaterinburg, the Romanov family was executed. All of them. Nicholas, Alexandra, their 5 children. The line of czars erased. Back in Moscow, the new capital, Lenin consolidated power. Industry was nationalized. Banks seized. The economy collapsed. Famine spread. Millions starved. But the Bolsheviks endured because they had a vision, a future, a red tomorrow, and they had Lenin. Even after surviving an assassination attempt in 1918, 2 bullets to the shoulder and neck, he kept going. But his health began to fail. He suffered strokes, grew paranoid, worried about his successor. He didn't trust Joseph Stalin, called him rude, dangerous, too powerful. But it was too late. In 1924, Lenin died. His body was embalmed, displayed in a grand mausoleum on Red Square, and his ideas, his revolution lived on. The Soviet Union was born, a vast, sprawling, nuclear-powered experiment that would define the next century. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. For now, in that cold Moscow winter of 1924, one chapter ended, and another, darker, louder, and far more complicated, was just beginning. The Iron Fist Stalin and the Price of Power. You ever heard a silence that felt dangerous? Not peaceful, not still, just tense. Like the moment before a curtain lifts, when everyone in the room knows something is about to happen, but no one dares to say it. That was Russia under Joseph Stalin. After Lenin died in 1924, there was no democratic handoff, no friendly transition. Just power sitting alone at the top, waiting for someone ruthless enough to claim it. And Stalin, he didn't reach for it. He outweighted, outmaneuvered, and outlasted everyone else. I once read a line in an old Cold War-era biography. It stuck with me. Stalin didn't rise. He buried the competition. That's about right. He started quietly, promoting allies, reassigning rivals. Whispers turned into rumors, rumors into arrests, arrests into disappearances. One by one, the original revolutionaries, those who had stood beside Lenin, vanished. Some were exiled. Others faced show trials with forced confessions and trembling voices. And some just disappeared. Their names crossed out in official records, their photos retouched to erase their faces. By the 1930s, Stalin's grip on power was absolute. He launched the 5-year plans, ambitious schemes, to drag the Soviet Union out of a feudal past and into an industrial future. Giant factories, power plants, steel mills, sprang up seemingly overnight. Trains thundered across the countryside. Entire cities were built from scratch. It worked in a brutal kind of way. The Soviet Union became a modern industrial power. But the human cost, it was staggering. Collectivization swept through the countryside. Peasants were forced to give up their land, their animals, even their tools. Small family farms were consolidated into massive state-run collectives. And when people resisted, as many did, Stalin responded with crushing force. The result was famine. Not just food shortages, but deliberate starvation. Especially in Ukraine, where millions died in what would later be called the Holodomor. Entire villages disappeared. Parents buried their children. And still grain was shipped out, sent to feed cities, or exported to boost Soviet prestige abroad. You know, I once found a diary from a teacher in Kharkiv barely survived that winter. She wrote, "We taught students about the greatness of the plan while watching them shrink in their chairs." That line never left me. And still Stalin pressed on. In the cities, the Great Purge began. Anyone could be accused: scientists, artists, generals, workers, even the secret police themselves. If you got a knock at the door after dark, you didn't sleep that night. People lived in fear, not of foreign invasion or natural disaster, but of saying the wrong word, knowing the wrong person, even thinking the wrong thought. Children were taught to report their parents. Neighbors spied on neighbors. It was a world where truth bent to fear. And through it all, Stalin stood tall, in posters, statues, textbooks. He was called the Father of Nations, the wise leader. His mustache became a symbol of authority, quiet, stern, eternal. He even rewrote history. Old Bolsheviks who once shared glory with Lenin, gone from photos, gone from textbooks. The past was edited to fit the present. I once saw a before and after image of a famous group portrait from the revolution. In the original, there were 6 men. In the revised version, only Stalin remained. The others had been removed as if they'd never lived. It's chilling. And yet here's the paradox. Millions believed in him. Genuinely. They saw the factories rise. They saw illiteracy fall. They watched a backward empire become a superpower. For many, that was enough. They called him strong, decisive, a protector of the motherland. It's hard, isn't it, to reconcile those two images, the builder and the butcher, the man who dragged a nation into the modern world and destroyed countless lives along the way. But maybe that's what power looks like when no one can say no. By the late 1930s, Stalin was unchallenged, but paranoia never sleeps. He distrusted everyone, foreigners, friends, even family. His own wife died under mysterious circumstances. Some say suicide, some whisper otherwise. Generals, the very ones he might need someday, were arrested or executed. The army's top leadership was gutted, just as storm clouds began to gather in Europe. And he saw it coming. The tension, the buildup, the possibility of another war. But even he couldn't predict how brutal it would be. That's where we'll go next. Into the fire. Into the war that would nearly break the world and change Russia forever. But for now, picture the Soviet Union in 1939. Industrialized, controlled, afraid, and under one man's shadow. A man who promised glory, delivered power, and demanded silence. Joseph Stalin didn't just lead a country, he became it. The motherland at war, Russia, in World War II. Do you remember where you were the first time you realized the world could fall apart overnight? For some in America, it might have been Pearl Harbor. For others, maybe it was 9/11. But in Russia, it was June 22, 1941. That was the day the sky broke open and everything changed. At dawn, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history. over 3 million German soldiers, along with tanks, aircraft, and artillery, stormed across the Soviet border. It was fast, brutal, and relentless. The Soviets were caught off guard. Despite warnings from spies and foreign diplomats, Stalin had refused to believe Hitler would betray the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the non-aggression agreement they signed in 1939. That pact had bought the USSR some time. In fact, in 1939, the Soviets had used it to invade eastern Poland and later took over the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, as well as parts of Finland and Romania. But by 1941, Hitler had new plans. And Stalin, he froze. In the first hours of the invasion, he reportedly disappeared from public view. For nearly a week, there was silence from the top. Generals waited, cities panicked, and German troops kept advancing fast. Minsk fell, then Kyiv, then Smolensk. Entire Soviet divisions were surrounded and crushed. Millions of soldiers were captured. Many never came home. But then something happened. Russia didn't collapse. It clenched its fists. Factories were moved east, beyond the Ural Mountains, miles away from the front. Trains ran day and night carrying machines, blueprints, and workers. Entire cities relocated. Imagine waking up one day and being told, pack up everything. Your city is moving. And somehow they did it. Women took over the factories. Children helped dig trenches. Artists painted propaganda. And Soviet citizens, despite the fear, the hunger, the loss, rallied. Not necessarily for Stalin, but for survival, for the motherland. You know, my grandfather used to say, when your back is to the wall, the only way forward is through the fire. By winter of 1941, the Nazis were at the gates of Moscow. But the cold, the legendary Russian winter hit hard. Temperatures dropped to -40. Machines froze. Fuel turned to jelly. And Soviet reinforcements, many arriving from Siberia, counterattacked. The Germans didn't take Moscow. The tide had begun to turn. Then came Stalingrad. That city wasn't just a battlefield. It was hell on earth. From the summer of 1942 to early 1943, the two sides fought block by block, room by room. Soldiers died fighting over stairwells, train stations, factories. Snipers picked off enemies from rooftops. Supplies ran low. Rats and frostbite became daily threats. And yet, the Soviets held. Then, in a massive counteroffensive, they surrounded the German Sixth Army. Trapped in the frozen ruins, tens of thousands of German soldiers surrendered in February 1943. It was a turning point, not just militarily, but psychologically. For the first time, the Nazi war machine looked vulnerable. From there, the Red Army began pushing west, through Ukraine, into Poland, across Eastern Europe. Cities were liberated, but at a terrible cost. Battles in Kursk, Leningrad, and later Berlin were won with rivers of blood. And everywhere the Soviets went, they saw the horrors of war. Burned villages, mass graves, the scars of genocide. They also left their own scars. Liberation sometimes came with occupation. Soviet soldiers were hailed as heroes, by some feared by others. Stalin wasn't just thinking of victory. He was thinking of what came after. When the Allies met at Yalta in early 1945, the map of Europe was already being redrawn. Roosevelt, Churchill, Stalin. They smiled for the cameras, but the tension was thick. Because everyone knew the war was ending, but a new kind of conflict was just beginning. Still, the cost of victory was enormous. By 1945, the Soviet Union had lost over 20 million lives, soldiers and civilians. 20 million. Entire generations vanished, cities leveled, families broken. But the Red Army marched into Berlin in May 1945. The Nazi regime collapsed. Hitler was dead. And on May 9th, the Soviets celebrated what they called Victory Day. It's still remembered, flags wave, anthems play, and veterans wear rows of medals that seem heavier than their jackets. There's pride in that victory, but also pain. And for many Russians, World War II wasn't just history. It was memory, passed down in photos, in songs, in the silence of empty chairs at family tables. I once visited a village near Smolensk, quiet little place. Every year they gather at a stone monument with 50 names carved into it. That's half the population before the war. And they read those names slowly, one by one. It's not loud. It's not political. Just a list of people who never came back. That's what the war left behind. But Stalin didn't stop there, because while the guns fell silent in Europe, another battle was already brewing. And this time it wasn't about tanks or trenches. It was about ideology, about nuclear bombs, about who would shape the future. That's where we're headed next, into the Cold War. But for now, let's just pause. Picture 1945. The red flag over Berlin, the parades, the silence behind the smiles. Russia had survived, but at a price so high, no one could ever forget. The long shadow. The Cold War and the Soviet gamble. I once read in an old history book that victory has a short memory, but empires have long shadows. And after World War II, the Soviet Union wasn't just a country anymore. It was a superpower. But power comes with paranoia. The minute the Red Army planted its flag in Berlin, the world split in two. Not by bullets anymore, but by ideas. On one side, the United States. Democracy, capitalism, jazz records and Coca-Cola. On the other, the Soviet Union. Communism, central planning, red banners and iron discipline. It wasn't just a disagreement, it was a standoff. And they called it the Cold War. No shots fired, well, not at first, but the world braced like a glass teetering on the edge of a table. Stalin moved fast. He tightened control over Eastern Europe, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania. These places didn't vote to join the communist bloc. They were pulled in brick by brick behind what Churchill called the Iron Curtain. And back in Moscow, the grip got tighter too. Dissent wasn't just frowned upon, it disappeared. I remember seeing grainy old news clips of Andrei Zhdanov, Stalin's cultural enforcer, waving his finger at poets. No more jazz, no more Western books. Art became propaganda. Music had to march. Then came the bomb. In 1949, the Soviets shocked the world by detonating their first atomic weapon. America had lost its monopoly on apocalypse. From there, it was a race, a nuclear arms race. Who could build more bombs faster, bigger? Who could aim them farther? By the mid-1950s, they had enough firepower to destroy the planet 10 times over. And then space. In 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik, the first satellite. Just a metal ball with a beep, really. But it sent chills down American spines. If they could launch that, they could launch anything. A few years later, Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space. "I see Earth," he radioed back. The whole world heard him. For one shining moment, it felt like the future belonged to Moscow. But things weren't as shiny down below. After Stalin's death in 1953, there was a brief thaw. Nikita Khrushchev took over, and he shocked everyone, especially the old guard, by denouncing Stalin. He called it de-Stalinization. Statues came down. Gulag camps were reviewed. Some prisoners were released. But freedom had limits. In 1956, Hungary tried to break away from Soviet influence. They called for democracy. Soviet tanks rolled in. Thousands died. Same story in Prague in 1968. It was like a parent saying, "Yes, speak your mind," until the kid actually did, and then came the slap. Meanwhile, the tension with America kept rising. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 brought the world closer to nuclear war than ever. The Soviets placed missiles in Cuba just 90 miles from Florida. President Kennedy said, "Remove them or else." For 13 days, the world held its breath. Finally, Khrushchev blinked. The missiles were removed. War was avoided, barely. But Khrushchev's reputation didn't recover. By 1964, he was ousted, too unpredictable, too erratic. Then came Leonid Brezhnev. Now Brezhnev wasn't flashy. He didn't do moonshots or dramatic speeches. But he brought something the Soviet Union hadn't had in a while: stability. Stability and stagnation. Throughout the 1970s, the economy slowed. Shelves were bare. Factories still ran on outdated machines. People joked that in the West, you could choose between 100 kinds of cereal. In the USSR, you chose whether or not the store had bread that day. And yet, there was pride. Pride in beating the Nazis. Pride in being feared. Pride in the Red Army marching through Red Square. But under the surface, cracks were growing. The war in Afghanistan, which began in 1979, became the Soviet Vietnam. What started as a quick intervention dragged on for a decade. Mountains swallowed convoys. Insurgents struck from caves. Mothers waited for sons who never came back. By the 1980s, the USSR was tired, not just physically but spiritually. Then, in 1985, a new face appeared: Mikhail Gorbachev. He was younger. He smiled more. He talked about glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. People could speak a little freer. Some books were unbanned. Newspapers ran stories that once would have gotten editors jailed. But with freedom came confusion. Factories didn't modernize fast enough. Old systems broke before new ones were ready. Prices fluctuated. Shelves stayed empty. The Soviet people were waking up, but to chaos, not clarity. And then came the revolutions. In 1989, the Eastern Bloc unraveled like a thread pulled too far. Poland held free elections. Hungary opened its border. East Germany watched, then surged. The Berlin Wall fell, that gray concrete scar, split by cheers and tears. One by one, Soviet allies slipped away. And back in Moscow, the USSR itself began to shake. In 1991, a group of hardliners tried to stage a coup. Tanks rolled into the capital. The old guard tried to take back control, but something had changed. People poured into the streets. Civilians stood in front of tanks. Boris Yeltsin, standing on a tank himself, rallied the crowd. The coup collapsed, and just like that, the Soviet Union dissolved. 15 new countries emerged. The red flag over the Kremlin came down. A tricolor took its place. After 70 years, the Soviet experiment was over. From rubble to revival, the fall of the USSR and the rise of modern Russia. You know, I still remember the footage on TV, December 25th, 1991. Not the usual Christmas programming. Just a quiet scene, the Soviet flag being lowered over the Kremlin for the last time. No parade, no grand speech, just a silence that said it all. The Soviet Union had ceased to exist. What came next was confusion. Imagine your whole life, every price, every job, every belief controlled by one system. And overnight, that system vanishes. That was Russia in the 1990s, a country reborn, but not ready. Boris Yeltsin, the man who had stood on a tank and defied the coup, became the first president of the Russian Federation. But heroism didn't equal leadership. He inherited a country with no roadmap. Factories that once made tanks now had to figure out how to make toasters, or anything people actually wanted. The ruble collapsed. People's life savings evaporated overnight. Pensions stopped. Salaries went unpaid for months. I read in a book once that Moscow cab drivers made more money than engineers, and vodka was cheaper than milk. Yeltsin tried shock therapy, a rapid shift from state control to free market capitalism. But it was more shock than therapy. State assets were sold off fast and cheap, often to insiders. A new class emerged, the oligarchs, men who got rich not from invention, but from privatization. Meanwhile, ordinary people stood in line for bread. The 1990s in Russia were wild, not just economically but politically. There were shootouts in the streets of Moscow. Mafia groups controlled entire neighborhoods. Even parliament rebelled. In 1993, Yeltsin ordered tanks to fire on the Russian White House, the seat of his own legislature. Yeah, a president shelling his own government building. That happened. And all this chaos, it wasn't just internal. The empire had broken into 15 pieces, remember? And some of those pieces had deep roots, old hatreds, new borders, ethnic conflicts. The Chechen Wars were the most brutal. Chechnya, a small republic in the south, wanted independence. Russia said no. In 1994, war broke out. Cities like Grozny were bombed into rubble. The war was bloody, confusing, and televised. Civilians were caught in the crossfire. Rebels used terror. Russia used tanks. And it dragged on. By the late 90s, Russia was exhausted. Corruption was rampant. The ruble collapsed again in 1998. Yeltsin's health was failing. So was his popularity. Then came the moment nobody expected. December 31st, 1999. While Americans were preparing for Y2K, Russians were watching Yeltsin, pale and tired, address the nation. "I am leaving," he said. "I have done all I could." And just like that, he handed power to his hand-picked successor, a quiet, serious former KGB officer named Vladimir Putin. At first, no one really knew who he was. I remember a joke from that time: Putin sounds like the name of a vodka. But he moved fast. In early 2000, he won the presidential election. And from that point on, Russia began to feel tighter. Putin spoke of restoring order, dignity, power. He cracked down on the oligarchs, at least the ones who didn't support him. He brought TV stations back under state control. He rebuilt the security services. And most importantly, he promised Russians they would no longer be humiliated. You see, for many Russians, the 1990s weren't just hard, they were humiliating. Queues for food. Western consultants treating them like a failed experiment. Former republics joining NATO, an alliance once built to oppose them. Putin played to that emotion. He said enough. Enough weakness. Enough chaos. Enough listening to the West. And the people listened. The economy improved, helped by rising oil prices. Wages went up. Cities felt safer. The image of Russia as a crumbling post-Soviet mess began to fade. Of course, freedoms also faded. Independent media struggled. Dissent was labeled unpatriotic. Some said, better a strong leader than no leader at all. By the mid-2000s, Putin wasn't just the president, he was Russia. The bear in the 21st century Russia and the modern world. And now, here we are. From ancient forests and Slavic tribes, to czars and revolutions, to tanks in Red Square and satellites in space. Russia has lived more lives than most nations can imagine. It has swung between empires and collapses, between famine and glory, between deep sorrow and fierce pride. Today, Russia is once again at the center of world attention. The Cold War may have ended, but the tensions never fully disappeared. In recent years, the world has watched Russia move with confidence and controversy. From the annexation of Crimea in 2014 to ongoing tensions with NATO and the United States. From cyber warfare and propaganda to the echoes of empire in modern politics. And yet beneath the headlines, Russia remains what it has always been, vast, complex, and full of contradiction. It is a place where poetry and power walk hand in hand, where ballet is performed in golden theaters, while battles rage in the background, where the winters are long and brutal, but the spirits somehow endure. You know, my father once said something that stuck with me. He said, "You can leave Russia, but Russia never leaves you." Maybe that's true for history too, because when we talk about Russia, we're not just talking about a country. We're talking about an idea, a force, a feeling, sometimes frightening, sometimes beautiful, always unforgettable. So tonight, as you close your eyes, I hope you carry a little bit of that story with you. Not the fear or the politics, but the people. The laughter echoing in Soviet kitchens. The old women sweeping snow off sidewalks at dawn. The children watching rockets launch into the stars. And maybe tomorrow, when the world feels confusing or cold, you'll remember this journey we took together. Through czars and revolutions, through silence and song, through shadows and light. Thanks for listening, my friend. Sleep well.